A hunter's journal revealed what his daughters practiced in the cellar with their brother. That's what historian Thea Gray discovered when she opened her grandfather's rotting chest in a forgotten Missouri cabin. Silas was a man who tracked every detail, every hunt, every season, every secret. But the pages that mattered most were written in a shaking hand, describing a horror he found in his own cellar, his two young daughters, his son Caleb. A ritual of shame he couldn't bring himself to fully name. The town knew something was wrong in that house. They saw the girls get sent away. They heard the whispers. But when Caleb disappeared to a brutal reform school and died there a year later, everyone chose silence, even when the pregnancies came, even when the babies didn't survive. Silas wrote it all down, then buried it with the dead. But some truths refuse to stay buried. What kind of evil takes root in a family's cellar, and how far will a community go to protect its darkest secret? The gravel road to the cabin crunched beneath Thea's rental car like old bones, each stone a small accusation against her return. Dr. Althea Gray had not set foot in the Missouri Ozarks for 23 years, not since she was 15, and desperate to escape the suffocating silence that clung to these hills like morning fog. Now, at 38, she had returned not by choice, but by death. Her mother Clara's quiet passing in a Kansas City nursing home, leaving behind only this rotting inheritance and a daughter who had spent decades trying to forget where she came from. The cabin squatted in the clearing like a wounded animal, its cedar shingles weathered to the color of dried blood, the front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Thea sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, studying the structure that had shaped her mother's childhood, and, by extension, her own fractured relationship with the woman who had raised her in emotional exile. She had come here with a simple plan: catalog the family history, document whatever was salvageable, and prepare the property for sale. It was an academic exercise, nothing more. She was good at academic exercises. They kept the world at a comfortable distance. The front door protested with a groan that seemed to echo from the foundation itself. Inside, the air tasted of mildew and memory, thick with the residue of a life lived in shadows. Clara's few possessions were scattered throughout the 3 small rooms like artifacts from an excavation. A rocking chair with 1 broken runner, mason jars filled with buttons and bottle caps, stacks of old almanacs that crumbled at her touch. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust that made Thea's historian's heart ache. This was not preservation. This was abandonment. It was the cellar that drew her attention, though she could not have said why. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing wooden steps that disappeared into darkness. Her grandfather Silas had used the space for storing preserves and hunting supplies, according to the few stories her mother had been willing to share. Thea descended carefully, her phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom to reveal shelves lined with empty jars and rusted tools. The detritus of a rural life lived close to the bone. She almost missed it entirely. The wooden chest was wedged behind a loose stone in the foundation, small enough that it might have been overlooked for decades. The wood was soft with rot, the metal hinges green with corrosion, but when she pried it open, the contents were remarkably well preserved: a hunting knife with an ivory handle, faded photographs of people she didn't recognize, and beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth like something precious, a leather-bound journal. Silas Gray had written in a careful, deliberate hand, dating each entry with the precision of a man who understood the importance of recording truth. The early pages were exactly what Thea expected from her grandfather's reputation: detailed observations about deer patterns, notes on the changing seasons, records of successful hunts. He wrote about the land with the reverence of someone who understood its moods, its secrets, its unforgiving nature. Reading his words, Thea could almost see him moving through the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged there. The tone began to shift somewhere in the middle of 1962. Silas's careful observations turned inward, focusing not on the woods, but on his own home. He wrote about his children, Clara, Mary Ann, and their brother Caleb with growing concern. There were references to hushed conversations and unnatural behaviors. He noted how his daughters had grown fearful of the cellar, how they flinched when he mentioned their brother's name. The entries became shorter, more cryptic, as if he were afraid to commit his suspicions to paper. Thea told herself these were the concerns of an isolated man struggling with children he didn't understand. Rural poverty could twist families in terrible ways, could force siblings into unhealthy dependencies. She had read enough social histories to recognize the patterns of dysfunction that emerged when communities were cut off from outside support. Perhaps her mother's coldness, her inability to show affection, stemmed from nothing more than the harsh realities of growing up poor and forgotten in the Missouri hills. She decided to drive into town the next morning to speak with the elderly residents who might remember her mother's family. The general store was run by a man named Abernathy, whose grandfather had known Silas well. Surely there would be stories, explanations, context that would help her understand the shadows that had shaped her mother's life. She wanted to feel compassion for Clara, to bridge the gulf that had separated them for so long. The journal might be the key to that reconciliation. But when she returned to the cabin that evening, when she sat down with the journal by lamplight and turned to the final entries, compassion was not what she found. Silas's handwriting had deteriorated, the letters shaky and desperate. The date was October 15th, 1963. The words seemed to burn themselves into her vision as she read, "Found them in the cellar again tonight. Clara and Mary Ann with Caleb. What I saw there, what the devil planted in them, I cannot write in full. The Lord forgive me, for I am too weak to stop what grows in the darkness of my own house. I saw the ritual of shame with my own eyes, and I did nothing." Thea's hands began to shake. She read the passage again, then a third time, each repetition making the meaning clearer and more terrible. This was not poverty. This was not dysfunction born of isolation. This was something monstrous, something that had been allowed to fester in the very place where she now sat. She looked up from the journal to find herself staring at the cellar door, and suddenly the cabin was not just a house filled with old belongings. It was a crime scene, and she was not just a historian cataloging the past. She was a witness to a horror that had never been named, never been acknowledged, never been stopped. The silence her mother had carried all her life was not the silence of poverty or shame. It was the silence of victims whose truth had been buried as surely as if they had been lowered into the ground. Sleep had become a stranger to Thea in the 3 days since she discovered her grandfather's confession. She found herself returning to the journal compulsively, reading and rereading the damning entry until the words seemed to blur together in the lamplight. Her academic training kicked in like muscle memory, driving her to cross-reference dates, to build a timeline, to transform horror into something manageable through the discipline of research. If she could understand the sequence of events, perhaps she could make sense of the silence that had followed. The county courthouse was a 40-minute drive from the cabin, a brick building that seemed to sag under the weight of decades' worth of secrets. The clerk, a tired woman with kind eyes, helped Thea navigate the maze of records with the patience of someone who understood that the past could be as urgent as the present. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, school enrollment records, each document was a piece of evidence in a case that had never been tried. She worked methodically through the boxes, her historian's instincts sharpened by personal stakes she had never felt before. The pattern emerged with brutal clarity. In November of 1963, just weeks after Silas's final journal entry, Caleb Gray had been enrolled at the Millbrook Reform School for Troubled Boys, a facility 200 miles away that specialized in what the brochures euphemistically called moral rehabilitation. Mary Ann, barely 16, had been married to Thomas Brewster, a widower 32 years her senior, in a ceremony so hastily arranged that the marriage license was filed just 3 days after the wedding. Only Clara remained in the house with Silas, her name disappearing from school records entirely, as if she had simply vanished from the world. Armed with this information, Thea drove back to town with a purpose that felt foreign to her academic nature. The general store occupied the corner of Main and Church Streets, its weathered sign advertising everything from fishing tackle to prayer books. Inside, shelves lined with canned goods and practical necessities created narrow aisles that seemed designed for private conversations. Behind the counter sat Mr. Abernathy, a man in his 70s with the kind of face that suggested he had heard every story the town had to offer and forgotten none of them. Thea introduced herself as Clara Gray's daughter, watching his expression shift from polite interest to something closer to wariness. When she mentioned her research into the family history, his responses became increasingly evasive. Yes, he remembered Silas as a good man, a skilled hunter who provided meat for families that couldn't afford store-bought protein. No, he couldn't recall much about the children, though he thought one of the girls had moved away young. His eyes kept drifting to the door as if he were calculating the distance to escape. The journal changed everything. When Thea placed it on the counter and opened to the crucial entry, Mr. Abernathy's careful composure cracked like ice under pressure. He read Silas's words in silence, his face growing paler with each line. Finally, he looked up at her with the expression of a man who had been carrying a burden for 60 years and was suddenly given permission to set it down. The truth spilled out in fragments, painful admissions punctuated by long silences. The town had known something was wrong in the Gray house. There had been whispers, suspicious glances, the kind of collective awareness that small communities develop about their darkest secrets. But Silas was a respected man, a pillar of the church, and when he made it clear that certain subjects were not to be discussed, the community had complied. It was easier, Mr. Abernathy explained with shame thick in his voice, to look away than to confront a horror that might implicate them all in their silence. Thea's disgust must have shown on her face because Mr. Abernathy's granddaughter Sarah, who had been stocking shelves in the back of the store, approached the counter with fire in her eyes. Sarah was perhaps 25, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had little patience for her grandfather's generation of willful blindness. She had grown up hearing fragments of stories, half-completed sentences that ended in uncomfortable silences, and she was tired of carrying the weight of other people's cowardice. Together, Thea and Sarah began to piece together Caleb's fate. The Millbrook Reform School had a reputation that extended far beyond its official mission. It was where families sent sons they could not control, where judges disposed of young men who had committed crimes too ugly for polite society to acknowledge. The records were sparse, deliberately incomplete, but they found evidence that Caleb had died there in 1964, less than a year after his arrival. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but former residents who had survived the institution told different stories about boys who had crossed the wrong guards, who had been found dead in their cells after mysterious accidents. As Thea's investigation deepened, the town's reaction shifted from passive resistance to active hostility. She woke one morning to find her rental car's tires slashed, the rubber cut so cleanly it could only have been done with a hunting knife. A dead raccoon appeared on the cabin's front porch, positioned with the kind of careful precision that suggested intimate knowledge of her grandfather's methods. At the Methodist church, where she had hoped to find records of her family's attendance, the congregation treated her like a disease, conversation stopping when she entered, eyes following her with undisguised contempt. The breaking point came during Sunday service when Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about the dangers of disturbing the peace of the dead. He spoke of agitators who came from outside communities to stir up old grievances, who used the pain of the past to justify causing hurt in the present. His eyes found Thea in the back pew as he quoted scripture about letting the dead bury their dead, about the importance of forgiveness over justice. The message was clear: she was not welcome here, and her pursuit of truth was seen as an act of aggression against the entire community. Walking back to her car after the service, Thea felt the weight of their collective judgment like a physical presence. These people had known about the horror in her grandfather's cellar, had chosen silence over action, and were now angry at her for refusing to honor that choice. She realized that her quest for understanding had become something far more dangerous, a direct challenge to the moral architecture that had allowed 3 children to suffer while an entire community looked away. The truth she was uncovering threatened not just individual reputations, but the very foundation of how these people understood themselves, and they would fight to protect that understanding, no matter what it cost her. The discovery came like all the worst revelations, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the courage to look closely enough. Thea had been working her way through her grandfather's journal page by page, examining not just the words but the physical evidence embedded within its binding. Between the final entries, pressed flat against the leather like a bookmark of damnation, she found a dried wildflower and a small newspaper clipping that had been carefully cut from the local weekly. The flower was so old it crumbled at her touch, but the newsprint, though yellowed and brittle, remained legible. The headline was brief and matter-of-fact. Brewster family mourns loss of infant. The single paragraph beneath described the stillborn death of an unnamed child born to Thomas and Mary Ann Brewster in July of 1964, less than 9 months after Mary Ann's hasty marriage to the older man. Thea stared at the clipping until the words began to swim before her eyes. The mathematics were brutally simple. If Mary Ann had given birth in July, she would have become pregnant in October or November of the previous year, exactly when Silas's journal entries described finding his children engaged in their ritual of shame in the cellar. The baby that died had been conceived in horror, carried in shame, and mourned by no one except perhaps a grandfather who preserved a flower and a death notice as the only monument to a life that should never have been necessary. Her hands shaking, Thea returned to the cabin's main room, where she had been sorting through her mother's belongings. Clara had left behind so little: a few changes of clothes, some costume jewelry, a collection of devotional books with passages highlighted in different colored inks. But now Thea approached these meager possessions with new eyes, looking not for sentimental value, but for hidden truths. She found them in a shoebox tucked beneath Clara's narrow bed, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. The letters were addressed to Mary Ann, but never sent, written in her mother's careful script on lined paper that suggested they had been composed over many years. The earliest was dated 1965, when Clara would have been 17. "My dear sister," it began, "I cannot sleep for thinking of what we shared in the darkness and what came of it afterward. Papa says we must never speak of these things, but the silence is eating me alive like a cancer. You at least had your sorrow recognized, a grave to visit even if no name was carved upon the stone. Mine was taken in the night, and I was told to be grateful for Papa's mercy." Thea read the letter 3 times before its meaning penetrated her academic defenses. Her mother had been pregnant too. Like Mary Ann, Clara had conceived a child in the horror of their brother's abuse, and like Mary Ann, she had lost that child. But where Mary Ann's loss had been acknowledged as a stillbirth, Clara's had been handled differently, dealt with in a way that left no public record, no official acknowledgement, only the haunted references in letters that were never sent to a sister who had been married off to escape the same fate. The subsequent letters painted a picture of a young woman slowly drowning in grief and isolation. Clara wrote about waking in the night with her arms empty, about hearing phantom cries that made her search rooms she knew were vacant. She described Papa's insistence that she was blessed to be spared the burden of raising such a child, but confessed that she felt cursed instead, condemned to carry the weight of a secret loss that grew heavier with each passing year. The letters revealed a progression from raw anguish to numb acceptance to a final terrible resignation that seemed to drain all emotion from her words. The last letter in the collection was dated 1987, written just months before Thea's own birth. "I am with child again," Clara wrote to the sister she had not seen in decades, "and this time I pray God will let me keep what grows within me. Perhaps this baby can fill the hollow place where the other should have been. Perhaps I can learn to love again, though I fear the well of my affection has been poisoned by what came before. I will try to be a mother to this one, though I do not know if I remember how." Thea set the letter down with hands that had gone completely steady, the way they did when shock moved beyond emotion into a realm where feeling became impossible. She understood now why her mother had been incapable of warmth, why Clara's love had always felt rationed and conditional. Thea had not been Clara's first child, but her second chance, a replacement for a baby, conceived in violence and disposed of in secrecy. Every interaction between them had been shadowed by the ghost of that lost sibling, every gesture of affection measured against a grief too deep to acknowledge. The foundation of her identity crumbled like the pressed flower in her grandfather's journal. She was not simply the daughter of an emotionally distant woman, but the child of a victim whose capacity for love had been shattered before Thea was ever born. Her academic achievements, her careful emotional distance from others, even her choice to study history, all of it had been shaped by a trauma she had never known existed, by a loss that had occurred before her birth but had defined every day of her life afterward. She found herself walking to the cellar door, drawn by a compulsion she could not name. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness where her mother and aunt had been victimized, where the horror that defined her family had taken root and spread through generations like a malignant growth. Standing in that underground space, surrounded by the detritus of her grandfather's hunting and preserving, Thea finally understood the true architecture of her inheritance. She was the granddaughter of a coward, the daughter of a victim, and the living embodiment of secrets that had poisoned 3 generations. The quiet academic quest she had begun just days earlier had become an excavation of her own soul, revealing not just the truth of her family's past, but the terrible foundation upon which her entire sense of self had been constructed. The silence her grandfather had enforced was not just a crime against his children, but a theft from their children's children, a wound that had been passed down like a genetic defect, shaping lives that should have been free from the burden of such knowledge. And now that she knew, now that the truth had been unearthed, she faced the unbearable question of what to do with a horror that could never be undone. For 3 days after discovering the letters, Thea did not leave the cabin. She moved through the small rooms like a sleepwalker, touching objects that had once belonged to her mother with a reverence she had never felt before. The rocking chair where Clara had nursed her as an infant now seemed sacred, a throne of sorrow where a broken woman had tried to rebuild her capacity for love. The devotional books took on new meaning when Thea realized they were not evidence of simple faith, but desperate attempts to find forgiveness for sins that had never been committed, to make peace with a God who had allowed such horror to flourish in the darkness of a family cellar. On the 4th morning, she found herself walking the hunting trails that wound through the forest behind the cabin. Silas's journal had described these paths in meticulous detail, noting the places where deer came to drink, the clearings where turkey gathered to feed, the hidden spots where a patient hunter could wait for hours without being detected. Following his words like a map, Thea traced the routes her grandfather had taken when he sought refuge from the horror festering in his own home. She began to understand that these woods had been his sanctuary, the place where he could pretend that the natural order still made sense, where predator and prey followed ancient rules that required no moral judgment. Walking these paths hour after hour, Thea felt something shifting inside her, like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. The rage that had sustained her investigation was burning out, leaving behind something more complex and far more dangerous: understanding. She began to see her grandfather not as the monster she had imagined, but as a man broken by a responsibility he could not bear. Silas had been raised in a world where fathers were expected to be moral authorities, protectors of innocence, guardians of family honor. When faced with an evil that defied all his categories of understanding, he had chosen the coward's path of silence rather than admit his complete failure to protect his children. The revelation came to her while she sat in a clearing where Silas had often waited for dawn, according to his journal entries from the years before the darkness descended. Her mother's silence had not been weakness, but a form of protection, a way of shielding others from the poison that had infected her own life. Clara had carried the weight of that secret not because she was complicit, but because she understood, perhaps better than anyone, how devastating the truth could be. She had lived her entire life as a buffer between the horror of the past and the possibility of the future, sacrificing her own emotional well-being to ensure that the cycle of damage ended with her generation. This understanding did not absolve anyone of their failures, but it transformed Thea's relationship to those failures. She was no longer the crusading historian seeking to expose injustice to an indifferent world. She was a mourner, charged with the sacred duty of honoring the dead and acknowledging the wounds that had been denied recognition for more than half a century. The external fight with the town suddenly felt hollow, a performance of righteousness that served no one except her own need for vindication. What mattered now was not punishment, but remembrance, not justice, but truth finally given voice. Returning to the cabin as the sun set behind the ridgeline, Thea began the most important work of her career. She assembled her findings with the precision of a master craftsman, weaving together the threads of Silas's journal, Clara's letters, and the documentary evidence she had gathered into a narrative that honored the complexity of their suffering. She was not writing for publication or academic acclaim, but for the victims themselves, creating a testament that acknowledged their pain without sensationalizing it, that named the truth without exploiting it for effect. The work consumed her for 2 weeks. She wrote by hand on legal pads, the physical act of forming letters connecting her more directly to the words than typing ever could. She included passages from her grandfather's journal that revealed his genuine love for his children alongside his ultimate failure to protect them. She quoted her mother's letters not as evidence of victimization, but as proof of a profound capacity for endurance that deserved recognition. She documented the town's complicity not as an indictment, but as a study in how good people could be corrupted by their own desire to avoid difficult truths. When the writing was finished, Thea drove to the county seat and purchased 2 small granite headstones from a monument company that asked no questions about names or dates. The stones were simple, elegant, unmarked except for a single word carved into each: Beloved. She arranged for delivery to the cabin, then called Sarah Abernathy, the only person in town who had shown any courage in confronting the past. The family plot behind the cabin had been overgrown for decades, a small fenced area where headstones tilted at odd angles and wildflowers grew unchecked among the graves. Thea and Sarah worked together in the late afternoon heat, clearing weeds and setting the new stones in places of honor among the older markers. One stone was positioned near where the infant from Mary Ann's marriage might have been buried in secret. The other marked a space for the child Clara had lost, the sibling Thea had never known existed, but who had shaped every day of her life. As they worked, Sarah shared fragments of stories her grandfather had finally begun telling, pieces of the puzzle that filled in details Thea could never have discovered on her own. The community had not been uniformly silent, she learned. There had been women who had tried to intervene, church members who had questioned Silas's sudden isolation of his daughters, teachers who had noticed signs of trauma that were ignored by those in authority. The failure had been systemic, but not universal, a distinction that mattered in ways Thea was only beginning to understand. When the stones were set and the small ceremony of placement was complete, Thea felt a peace she had not experienced since opening her grandfather's journal. She had not achieved the public vindication she had initially sought. had not forced the community to confront its complicity in any dramatic way. Instead, she had accomplished something far more important. She had refused to let the victims remain nameless casualties of a family's shame. The headstones would weather and fade with time, but they would endure as physical proof that these children had existed, had mattered, had deserved better than the silence that had erased them from history. In giving them this small monument, Thea had finally understood her true inheritance, not the burden of her family's secrets, but the responsibility to ensure that such secrets could never again be buried so completely that they left no trace at all. Mr. Abernathy appeared at the cabin door 3 days after Thea had placed the unmarked headstones in the family plot, carrying a wooden box that looked as weathered as the man himself. His face bore the expression of someone who had wrestled with conscience and finally allowed it to win. He set the box on the kitchen table with the careful reverence of a man handling relics, then looked at Thea with eyes that held 60 years of accumulated regret. The box contained church records that his own grandfather had kept hidden, documents that should have been part of the official archives, but had been deliberately excluded from the historical record. Among them were letters written by concerned parents in the late 1950s and early 1960s, complaints about Caleb Gray's behavior that painted a disturbing picture of a predator whose activities had begun long before the horror in his family's cellar. One mother described finding her 8-year-old daughter in tears after a church social, unwilling to explain why she was afraid of the Gray boy. Another family had quietly withdrawn their children from Sunday school after their son came home with bruises he claimed were from playing games with Caleb in the church basement. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Caleb had not been a troubled youth corrupted by circumstance, but a methodical predator who had used the trust and protection of his family name to access victims throughout the community. The church leadership had known, the parents had suspected, and yet nothing had been done beyond quiet warnings and careful separations that left other children vulnerable. When Caleb turned his attention to his own sisters, he was simply expanding a campaign of abuse that the community had already chosen to handle through willful ignorance and strategic silence. Reading these documents, Thea felt the final pieces of the puzzle click into place with a sound like breaking glass. Her grandfather's ultimate failure had not been an isolated moment of cowardice, but the culmination of a community-wide conspiracy of denial that had enabled years of predatory behavior. The shame that had consumed Silas was not just personal, but collective, the recognition that his own silence had been part of a larger pattern of complicity that stretched far beyond his family's property lines. Yet, as damning as this evidence was, Thea found herself feeling no desire to expose it to the wider world. The guilty were long dead, and the victims deserved better than to have their suffering turned into a public scandal that would serve no purpose except to satisfy the contemporary appetite for historical outrage. Instead, she began to plan something more meaningful, a ceremony that would honor the truth without exploiting it, that would give voice to the silenced without turning their pain into entertainment. She invited only Sarah and Mr. Abernathy to join her at the headstones on a Sunday afternoon when the autumn light filtered through the trees like cathedral windows. The three of them stood in the overgrown family plot, surrounded by the weathered markers of previous generations, as Thea opened her grandfather's journal to the early entries that revealed a different man than the one who had written the final damning pages. She read aloud his descriptions of teaching Clara to identify bird calls, his pride in Mary Ann's skill at preserving fruit, his hopes for Caleb's future as a hunter and provider. These passages painted a portrait of a father who had genuinely loved his children before the darkness consumed his family, a man whose moral failure was made more tragic by the depth of his earlier devotion. Then she read from her mother's letters, giving voice for the first time to Clara's decades of silent suffering. The words carried across the small cemetery like a prayer, finally answered, acknowledging grief that had never been witnessed, honoring loss that had never been mourned. Mr. Abernathy wept openly as she read Clara's description of empty arms reaching for a child who would never be held, while Sarah stood with fierce dignity, bearing witness to pain that her generation had inherited without understanding its source. When the readings were finished, the three of them stood in silence as the shadows lengthened and the air grew cool with the promise of evening. It was not a grand ceremony or a public vindication, but it was something more important, a moment when truth was finally spoken in the presence of those who had the courage to hear it, when victims were acknowledged by witnesses who understood the weight of what they were receiving. The cycle of silence that had poisoned 3 generations had been broken not through exposure, but through recognition, not through punishment, but through the simple act of refusing to let the dead remain nameless. As autumn deepened into winter, Thea made the decision that surprised even herself. She would not sell the cabin as she had originally planned, but would preserve it as a place of memory, a testament to lives that had been shattered but would not be forgotten. She had the structure restored with careful attention to historical accuracy, turning it into a private retreat where she could continue her work as a historian while serving as guardian to her family's complex legacy. The cellar where the horror had occurred was sealed but not destroyed, transformed into a meditation space where the weight of the past could be acknowledged without being sensationalized. On her final evening in Missouri before returning to her teaching position, Thea sat on the cabin's restored porch and looked out across the Ozark Hills that had shaped her family for generations. The landscape spread before her in layers of shadow and detail, holding secrets that would never be fully known but no longer needed to remain completely hidden. She had not achieved the public justice she had initially sought, had not forced a community to confront its complicity in dramatic fashion, but she had accomplished something far more profound. She had broken the cycle of silence that had defined her family's history, giving voice to victims who had carried their pain in isolation for more than half a century. She had finally understood the ghost who had been her mother, recognizing Clara not as a woman incapable of love, but as someone whose capacity for affection had been damaged by trauma too deep to heal. Most importantly, she had transformed her academic pursuit of truth into something more meaningful, a moral reckoning that honored the complexity of human failure without excusing it, that acknowledged the weight of inherited suffering without being crushed by it. The relentless pursuit of truth had indeed cost her the peace of mind that came with ignorance, but it had given her something far more valuable, a legacy she could claim with dignity and a story that would, finally, be told. As darkness settled over the hills and the first stars appeared in the clear Missouri sky, Thea understood that she was no longer running from her inheritance, but embracing it, ready to carry forward the burden and the gift of remembering what others had chosen to forget.